The salt air of the Adriatic swept through the streets of Trieste, carrying with it the scent of roasted coffee and old stone. For Adriana, those scents used to promise a future that never arrived. Now, they were simply the backdrop to a life she had rebuilt from the rubble. The Gilded Cage. In high school, Francesco was a force of nature. He was the boy every girl whispered about in the hallways, golden, athletic, and possessed of a charm that felt like a spotlight. When he chose Adriana, she felt like the protagonist of a movie. She ignored the quiet shadow in the back of the classroom, Marco, the boy with the observant eyes and the sketchbook, who looked at her as if she were a masterpiece he wasn't yet brave enough to touch. By their final year at the University of Trieste, the silence from Marco's side had become deafening. Adriana liked him, perhaps even loved the idea of him, but Marco remained paralyzed by his own shyness. When Francesco knelt in the middle of the Piazza Unita d'Italia with a diamond ring, Adriana said yes. She chose the man who spoke up, even if his voice was often too loud. The marriage, however, was a slow-motion disaster. Francesco's libido wasn't a quirk, it was a weapon. 2 years in, the infidelity was no longer a secret, and when Adriana finally found the courage to confront him, the charm vanished, replaced by a cold, abusive streak. By the 4th year, the woman who had once been the envy of the school was a ghost of herself. She walked away with nothing but her dignity and a divorce decree. A chance encounter in Piazza Garibaldi. Adriana retreated. She avoided the old spots, the mutual friends, and the prying eyes of Trieste's social circles. But fate has a way of navigating the narrowest alleys. One evening, she sat alone at a small table in a cafe bar in Piazza Garibaldi. The sun was dipping low, casting long, amber shadows. A sleek black car pulled up, and 3 men in sharp suits stepped out, laughing with the adrenaline of a victory. Among them was Marco. He wasn't the shy boy from the back of the class anymore. He was a formidable lawyer, fresh from winning a high-stakes case at the tribunal. When his eyes met hers, the world stopped. "Adriana," he whispered. This time, he didn't look away. Their rekindled connection wasn't a lightning bolt, it was a slow, steady hearth. They spent evenings walking along the Molo Audace, talking about the years they had lost to silence. Marco confessed he had never stopped looking for her in every room he entered. 2 years later, under the vaulted ceilings of the church of San Jakamo, they were married. It was a royal affair, not because of the guest list, but because of the sheer, radiant joy that filled the space. The ghost of Barcola. 10 years passed like a beautiful dream. On a bright Sunday afternoon, the sun was sparkling off the water at Barcola. Adriana and Marco walked along the seafront, the laughter of their 2 children, Gabrielle and Georgia, ringing out as they chased seagulls. Marco had his arm around Adriana's shoulder, a silent anchor of devotion. Then, they saw him. A man sat on a nearby bench, hunched over and clutching a tattered coat. He looked 60, though he was barely 40. His skin was sallow, his eyes vacant, and his hands shook with the tremors of a body worn out by excess and a life without discipline. It was Francesco. Adriana slowed her pace, a flicker of pity crossing her face for the man who had once had everything and thrown it all away for the sake of a temporary thrill. Francesco looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a split second. He saw the beautiful woman, the successful husband, and the happy children. He saw the life that could have been his, had he known the value of what he held. He looked away. First, Marco squeezed Adriana's hand, pulling her back to the present. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. Adriana looked at her children, then up at the man who had finally found his voice when she needed it most. She smiled, the sea breeze catching her hair. "Yes," she said. "Everything is exactly as it should be." The transition from old classmates to new lovers began in a corner of Trieste that felt both timeless and brand new. Here is a deeper look into the moments that defined Adriana and Marco's journey. The first date. A conversation 10 years late. They met at a quiet, wood-paneled enoteca tucked away from the main tourist paths. The air smelled of aged oak and the sharp, clean scent of the sea. For the first 20 minutes, the silence was heavy. Not with awkwardness, but with the weight of everything they hadn't said since high school. Marco reached across the table, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "I used to practice what I would say to you," he began, his voice steadier than she remembered. In the hallways, during calculus, even at graduation. I had entire speeches memorized. Adriana smiled, a bittersweet curve of her lips. Why didn't you ever say them, Marco? I was waiting for a reason to stay. I was a boy who lived in his own head, Marco admitted. I saw Francesco. So loud, so certain of himself, and I thought that was what a woman like you deserved. Someone who took up space. I didn't realize until much later that taking up space isn't the same as protecting it. Adriana looked down at her hands, the faint scars of a difficult marriage hidden beneath the table. He took up too much space. He left no room for me to breathe. I used to look at you in class and wonder why you were so quiet. I thought you were bored of us. I didn't know you were observing. I wasn't just observing, Marco said, leaning in. The shyness was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had fought for his career and his character. I was admiring. I saw the way you defended the kids who got bullied. I saw the way you looked at the ocean when you thought no one was watching. I stayed single because every time I met someone else, I found myself looking for the girl from Trieste who loved the wind. Adriana felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. I'm not that girl anymore, Marco. I'm a bit more broken now. We're all a bit weathered by the Bora, he said, referencing the famous Trieste wind. But the stone buildings of this city are more beautiful because they've survived the storms. So are you. The wedding. A royal vow at San Jakamo. The wedding at the church of San Jakamo was the talk of the city. It wasn't just the scale of the event that made it royal, it was the sense of justice restored. After years of darkness, Adriana was finally stepping into the light. The atmosphere. The square outside the church was crowded with locals and well-wishers. The facade of San Jakamo stood imposing and grand, decorated with massive garlands of white lilies and olive branches, symbols of purity and peace. Inside, the incense swirled in the shafts of sunlight piercing through the high windows, creating a golden haze over the marble aisles. The procession. When the doors opened, a hush fell over the congregation. Adriana appeared, a vision of timeless elegance. She wore a gown of heavy Italian silk, the train sweeping behind her like a breaking wave. There was no trace of the withdrawn, hurt woman she had been 2 years prior. Marco stood at the altar, flanked by his legal colleagues, but he saw none of them. His eyes were fixed solely on her. As she reached him, he didn't wait for the priest's prompt. He took her hands immediately, his grip firm and grounding. The vows. The ceremony was traditional, yet the exchange of rings felt profoundly personal. Marco's vow. I spent my youth silent, watching you from afar. I spend my manhood promising that you will never have to wonder if you are loved, if you are safe, or if you are enough. My home is wherever you stand. Adriana's vow. You saw me when I was invisible to myself. You waited for the storm to pass, and then you built me a harbor. I choose you, today and every day, because you are the quiet strength I always needed. The reception followed at a villa overlooking the Gulf of Trieste. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, the couple danced to a slow string quartet. It was a celebration of a second chance. A royal beginning for a love that had been patient enough to wait for its time. The years following their marriage were not just defined by romantic healing, but by a powerful professional ascent. Together, Marco and Adriana became one of Trieste's most respected power couples, balancing the weight of their careers with the warmth of their home. The architect of justice. Marco's legal rise. Marco's transformation from a shy, observant boy into a titan of the Italian legal system was fueled by the very trait that once held him back, his ability to listen. While other lawyers relied on theatrics, Marco relied on precision. He specialized in high-stakes civil litigation and human rights, eventually becoming a senior partner at a prestigious firm near the Tribunal di Trieste. He became known as the Silent Blade, because he would sit through hours of testimony, barely taking a note, only to dismantle an opposing witness with 3 perfectly placed questions. His most famous victory, the one that preceded his reunion with Adriana at Piazza Garibaldi, involved a complex corporate fraud case that saved hundreds of local jobs. He wasn't just working for a paycheck, he was working to ensure that the bullies of the corporate world didn't win. His office, overlooking the Canal Grande, was filled with awards, but the only photo on his desk was a candid shot of Adriana laughing at the beach. The curated life. Adriana's professional rebirth. Adriana didn't just recover, she flourished. Leveraging her eye for beauty and her resilient spirit, she became a renowned restoration architect. She dedicated her career to breathing life back into the crumbling neoclassical buildings of Trieste, a poetic mirror to her own life. She led the renovation of several historic palazzos, earning a reputation for being able to see the hidden strength in structures others deemed beyond repair. Her work was featured in international design journals, and she was eventually appointed to the city's Heritage Commission. She wasn't just Francesco's former victim anymore, she was the woman who was literally rebuilding the face of the city she loved. The shadow at Barcola, a contrast in fates. The Sunday at Barcola was quintessential Trieste. The white stone of the promenade was hot under the sun, and the scent of pine trees mingled with the salt spray. Gabrielle, 10, and Georgia, 8, were ahead of their parents, their high-pitched laughter cutting through the hum of the crowd. Gabrielle stopped first, his soccer ball tucked under his arm. He slowed to a walk, his brow furrowed as he looked at a bench near the edge of the pine grove. "Mama, look," Georgia whispered, tugging at Adriana's sundress. "That man, is he okay? He looks like a scary ghost." The children, raised in a home filled with light, music, and security, had never seen such profound despair up close. They saw a man whose skin looked like gray parchment, his hair a matted silver, and his eyes fixed on the pavement as if he were searching for a lost coin. Adriana and Marco caught up to them. Adriana's heart did a strange, painful somersault. Up close, the ghost was unmistakable. It was Francesco. The dream of the school had become a nightmare of a man. His reckless lifestyle and the hollow pursuit of his own appetites had aged him 30 years in 10. He was the living embodiment of what happens when a person has no anchor. "Is he sick, Papa?" Gabrielle asked, his voice full of the innocent empathy Marco had taught him. Marco looked at Francesco, not with the anger of a rival, but with the heavy, quiet pity of a victor. He saw the man who had once had Adriana's heart and thrown it away. Marco didn't shield his children's eyes, he let them see the reality of a life lived without honor. "He's lost, Gabrielle," Marco said softly, his hand resting firmly on his son's shoulder. Francesco looked up then. For a heartbeat, he saw them. The beautiful architect, the powerful lawyer, and the two vibrant, healthy children who bore no resemblance to him. He saw the legacy he could have had. A cough racked his thin frame, and he quickly looked away, pulling his threadbare coat tighter despite the summer heat. "Can we give him some water?" Georgia asked, reaching for her bottle. "No, darling," Adriana said, her voice steady but soft. She felt a final, lingering thread of her past snap. The fear was gone, even the pity was fading into a neutral, distant memory. He has to find his own way now. As they walked past, the children soon returned to their games, their laughter echoing once more. Adriana squeezed Marco's hand, and he kissed her temple. Behind them, the man on the bench remained a silent, haggard monument to the choices of the past, while they walked forward into a sun-drenched future. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Gulf of Trieste in bruised purples and deep indigos. Inside the sprawling, light-filled apartment that Adriana had designed herself, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the hollow chill they had witnessed at Barcola. The heart of the home, Gabrielle and Georgia. Their home was a sanctuary of high ceilings, exposed stone, and tall windows that invited the Adriatic breeze. It was a place where the silence was never heavy, only peaceful. Gabrielle, at 10, was a thoughtful mirror of his father. He inherited Marco's observant nature and spent hours at a large oak desk, sketching the sailboats he saw from the balcony. He was a boy of quiet passions, captain of his local youth soccer team, and a protector of his younger sister. Georgia, 8, was the spark of the household. She possessed Adriana's radiant smile and a curiosity that knew no bounds. She was a gifted pianist, and the trill of Chopin often drifted through the hallways before dinner. In their home, the children were encouraged to speak their minds, a stark departure from the suppressed environment Adriana had endured in her first marriage. There were no raised voices here, only debates, laughter, and the steady rhythm of a family that truly liked one another. Every evening, the family shared a meal at a long wooden table. It was a sacred time. They talked about the victory of the day, Gabrielle's successful slide tackle or Georgia's new melody. It was the foundation of the emotional security that Francesco had never been able to provide. Reflection in the moonlight. After the children were tucked away, the house fell into a comfortable hum. Marco and Adriana stepped onto the terrace, glasses of water in hand, looking out toward the distant lights of the Miramare castle. The encounter at Barcola hung in the air, a ghost they needed to finally lay to rest. "Did you see his hands, Marco?" Adriana asked softly, leaning against the stone balustrade. They were shaking. He looked so diminished. Marco stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. The warmth of his presence was an immediate comfort. "I saw. It's a hard thing to witness, the physical toll of a life lived without a center." Adriana turned in his arms to face him. "For a long time, I was afraid of him. Even after the divorce, I was afraid of the shadow he cast over my memories. But today, looking at him while holding Gabrielle's hand, the fear was gone. There was only a profound sense of distance. He felt like a stranger I'd read about in a sad book." "He was the man the world told you to want," Marco said, his voice a low rumble. "But he never learned that love is a discipline, not just an impulse. He spent his life consuming people, and eventually, he consumed himself." Adriana looked back toward the hallway where her children slept. "When Georgia asked if we could give him water, my heart broke for her innocence. But I realized then that I have succeeded. She doesn't know what a monster looks like because she lives in a house built on kindness. She only saw a man who was thirsty." "That is your greatest restoration project, Adriana," Marco whispered, kissing her forehead. "Not the palazzos or the museums. It's this. The life we built out of the ruins." They stood there for a long time, watching the dark sea. The memory of Francesco was no longer a wound, it was merely a reminder of the narrow escape Adriana had made, and the quiet, brilliant man who had been waiting in the wings to catch her. The synergy between Adriana and Marco wasn't limited to their home, it spilled over into the very fabric of Trieste. Their most significant professional collaboration came when the city announced the Porto Vecchio Restoration Project, a massive undertaking to convert the crumbling Austro-Hungarian warehouses into a modern cultural hub. The power of collaboration. The Porto Vecchio Project. The project was a minefield of bureaucratic red tape, historical preservation laws, and complex property rights. It required a visionary architect and a brilliant legal mind. Adriana's vision. Adriana was the lead architect. She spent weeks in the old salt-crusted warehouses, sketching how the sunlight hit the red brick at noon. She didn't want to tear anything down, she wanted to listen to the buildings. Her design proposed a glass and steel promenade that would weave through the original stone structures, creating a space for museums and tech startups while honoring the city's maritime soul. Marco's shield. While Adriana dreamt in sketches, Marco fought in the boardroom. The project faced stiff opposition from developers who wanted to raise the history for high-rise condos. Marco spent months navigating the tribunal and the regional council. He drafted the Heritage Covenant, a groundbreaking legal framework that ensured the land could never be sold to private interests that would destroy its historical integrity. "She provides the soul of the city," Marco once told the city council during a heated hearing. "I am simply here to ensure that Seoul has a permanent home." Their collaboration became a local legend. Adriana would present her blueprints to the board, and whenever a skeptical politician questioned the legality of a specific structural change, Marco would calmly slide a leather-bound brief across the table, citing a 19th-century maritime law he had unearthed to support her. They were a closed loop of creativity and protection. A typical morning in the House of Light. Morning in their apartment began not with an alarm, but with the soft, rhythmic sounds of a household in harmony. 6:30 a.m. The quiet hour. Marco was always the first awake. He cherished the silver light that hit the Adriatic before the city stirred. He would grind fresh coffee beans, a ritualistic scent that signaled the start of the day, and sit on the balcony with a legal brief. Shortly after, Adriana would join him, draped in a silk robe, leaning her head on his shoulder. They rarely spoke during this time, they simply watched the white sails of the early fishing boats. 7:15 a.m. The creative chaos. The peace was broken by the sound of Georgia practicing a few scales on the piano, her way of waking up her fingers, and Gabrielle rummaging through his closet for his soccer jersey. Breakfast was a communal affair at the large oak table. Unlike the silent, Tense meals Adriana remembered from her past. These mornings were filled with the schedule. Marco would quiz Gabrielle on his Latin vocabulary. Adriana would help Georgia finish a sketch for her art class. 8 a.m. The departure. The departure was a choreographed dance. Marco would grab his leather briefcase, and Adriana would gather her rolls of architectural blueprints. There were always three things before the door closed: a check to ensure everyone had their lunch, a reminder of who was picking up the kids from music and sports, and a lingering kiss between Marco and Adriana that made the children giggle and roll their eyes. "Have a good day, architect," Marco would say as they reached the street where their paths diverged toward their respective offices. "Win your cases, counselor," Adriana would reply with a wink. The legacy of the day. As the sun climbed higher over the Piazza Unita d'Italia, the two of them moved through the city as separate forces of nature, but always anchored by the knowledge of what awaited them at dinner. The morning routine wasn't just a schedule, it was the daily reaffirmation of the peace they had fought so hard to build. The professional lives of Marco and Adriana were often the talk of the dinner table, but for Gabrielle and Georgia, seeing their parents, in the wild, was like watching superheroes step out of a comic book. A day at the office. The architect and the advocate. The Friday before their trip, the children were given a half day at school to shadow their parents. They started at Adriana's studio, a sun-drenched loft in a repurposed warehouse near the Grand Canal. Adriana's studio, where dreams take shape. Georgia stood mesmerized by a sprawling 3D model of a new library Adriana was designing. Adriana, wearing her signature drafting glasses and a charcoal-smudged linen shirt, wasn't the soft mama who tucked them in at night. She was a commander. The light must hit the reading nook at 4 p.m., Adriana told a junior architect, her voice firm and melodic. "If we lose the sun, we lose the soul of the room." Georgia watched as her mother adjusted a tiny piece of balsa wood with surgical precision. To the children, Adriana didn't just build walls, she seemed to be capturing the very air of Trieste and turning it into something solid. The tribunal. Marco's silent command. In the afternoon, they walked to the Tribunal di Trieste. Inside the hushed, marble halls, they sat in the back row of a courtroom. Marco was at the podium, dressed in his black legal robes. He didn't raise his voice once. Instead, he laid out a series of documents, his arguments clicking into place like the gears of a watch. Gabrielle leaned over to Georgia and whispered, "Papa looks like a king." Marco caught their eyes for a split second, a tiny, proud smile ghosting his lips before he turned back to the judge. Seeing their father command the room with nothing but logic and integrity gave the children a new understanding of strength. It wasn't about being the loudest, it was about being the most prepared. The weekend at Miramare Castle, a fairy tale reality. That Saturday, the family took the short drive along the coast to Miramare Castle. The white Istrian stone of the castle gleamed against the turquoise backdrop of the Adriatic, surrounded by the lush green of the botanical gardens. The walk through the gardens. As they wandered through the exotic trees planted by Archduke Maximilian, Gabrielle and Georgia ran ahead, playing hide and seek among the statues. Marco and Adriana walked arm in arm, the sea breeze tossing their hair. "Do you remember coming here as teenagers?" Adriana asked, looking up at the castle's battlements. "I remember seeing you here on a school trip," Marco admitted. "You were sitting by the Sphinx, reading. I wanted to come sit next to you, but I walked halfway there and turned around. I spent the rest of the day looking at the plants so I wouldn't have to face my own nerves." Adriana laughed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And now look, we aren't just visitors, we're the ones building the history of this city." The moment on the pier. They walked out onto the stone pier that juts into the sea. The children sat at the edge, their legs dangling over the water, watching the small fish dart between the rocks. Gabrielle looked back at his parents. "Mama, will our house be a castle one day?" Adriana knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead. "A house is just stone and wood, Gabrielle. A home is a castle because of the people inside it. We already have everything we need." The reflection of a life well lived. As the golden hour began, casting a pink hue over the white walls of Miramare, the family sat on a bench overlooking the Gulf. They watched the white sails of the Barcolana boats in the distance. There was a profound peace in the air. This was the life Adriana had once thought was impossible, a life where she was Respected in her work, adored in her home, and protected by a man who saw her as his equal. The memory of the haggard man on the bench at Barcola felt like a ghost from a different lifetime, one that could no longer touch them. As they walked back to the car, Georgia began humming a melody she had been practicing. Marco picked her up and swung her around, her laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls. They were a family of light, built on the foundations of a love that had waited until the time was exactly right. The grand dinner party was not just a social obligation, it was a celebration of the community Adriana and Marco had spent a decade building. They chose to host the event at their apartment, which featured a sprawling terrace overlooking the Piazza della Borsa, allowing the history of Trieste to serve as the evening's natural decor. The grand gala of the advocate and the architect. The home was transformed. Adriana's keen eye for design was evident in every detail. The table was a long expanse of reclaimed oak, adorned with white hydrangeas and tall, slender candles that flickered against the evening breeze. The guest list. The guest list was a who's who of Trieste's intellectual and professional elite. There were judges from the tribunal in sharp tuxedos, architects with colorful scarves, and preservationists who had worked alongside Adriana on the Porto Vecchio. Marco moved through the crowd with a natural grace, no longer the boy who stayed in the shadows. He greeted everyone with a firm handshake and a genuine question, making the youngest legal clerks feel as important as the senior partners. Adriana, in a gown of midnight blue that matched the Adriatic, was the perfect hostess, bridging the gap between the technical world of engineering and the human world of storytelling. The toast, as the main course, a delicate seafood risotto, was served. Marco stood up, clinking his glass. The chatter died down instantly. In this city, we talk a lot about foundations, Marco said, glancing at Adriana. In law, they are the principles that keep us just. In architecture, they are the stones that keep us standing. But tonight, looking at this table, I am reminded that the strongest foundation is the one built on trust and second chances. To Trieste, and to the people who make it a home. The applause was warm and sincere. In that moment, the royal couple of Trieste was more than a title, it was a testament to a life built on mutual respect. The legacy continues. Gabrielle and Georgia. As the years passed, the influence of that household bore fruit in the lives of the two children who had watched their parents lead with integrity. Gabrielle, the defender of history. Gabrielle didn't choose between law and architecture, he merged them. He grew up to become a land use and environmental lawyer. Inspired by his father's heritage covenant and his mother's love for the land, he became the city's leading advocate for sustainable urban development. He had his father's calm courtroom presence but spoke with his mother's passion for the soul of a building. He married a fellow scholar, and they remained in Trieste, keeping the family's presence strong in the city's legal circles. Georgia, the architect of harmony. Georgia's childhood spent between piano keys and drafting tables led her to a career in acoustic architecture. She traveled the world designing concert halls that were as visually stunning as they were sonically perfect. She became famous for her ability to make a room sing. Even as she worked in Paris and New York, she always returned to Trieste for the summer, sitting at the same piano in her parents' home to compose new melodies. And evenings close. Back at the dinner party, long after the guests had departed and the candles had burned low, Marco and Adriana stood on the terrace alone. The city was quiet, the only sound the distant tolling of a bell from San Giusto. "They saw us tonight," Adriana whispered, referring to the children who had helped greet guests before heading to bed. "They saw what it looks like to be happy." "They didn't just see it," Marco replied, pulling her close as they looked out over the darkened gulf. "They lived it, and that is the only legacy that matters." In the distance, the lights of Barcola twinkled. A reminder of where they had been, and a silent witness to the enduring strength of the life they had chosen together.